And I do technical sales at IP Architects, and we do consulting around the world. And I was asked to do this the other night out of surprise because this isn't really a Mikrotik subject. It's just white box networking in general and how we help large entities or companies save money and or gain control of their resources using white box as a tool. And so I wrote something specifically for those that want to adopt white box or those that maybe want to sell white box if you're here, if you're a VAR of some sort. The background, I've been in IT for 28 years. I'm actually a storage guy. I know about SANs and IOPS and those types of things, and I happen to have a background in voice and how to do large-scale voice networks. I happen to be VMware's, I think I'm in their 100th customer range because I bought their software in 1996. And a lot of the people that I knew back in 96 have long since retired and live in fancy places on islands. But it's been a good run for me with them. At IP Architects, we are a networking firm, and we do carrier and service provider and data center networking. And we focus primarily on protocols, BGP, MPLS, and OSPF. So you can have I use a term, don't know if my guys are going to yell at me, but I use a term called self-repairing because networks do break. You just don't want your users or customers to know about it. We do monitoring of networks, we do managed networks, we do lots of soak testing or load testing for people that have ideas that they want to get out into the marketplace and they want to make sure that it can scale. How many users can I get? How much bandwidth can I run through for IPsec tunnels? Kind of work. Today, what is white box? And what I want to hopefully get across to you is how does white box fit into your world? Is that better? Ooh, that's better. I sound like Elvis. So, that's almost too much. The best part about white box is the lifecycle CapEx and OpEx savings. It will save you an enormous amount of money, and there's a story I will tell here in a little bit about that. You will gain control over your network because you are going to be running the components that you want on your network and not components that you don't. And in a way, it's kind of like pharmaceuticals. If drugs mix with other drugs and cause bad things, protocols that don't need to be used don't need to mix with other things to cause things to happen in your network. So it's not service affecting. White box is also an open architecture. And this all came from the guys at Google and Facebook, and they didn't want anybody to tell them how to do what they had to do. They wanted to do it themselves. And well, they're Google. That's what Google does. So in white box, the guys at these big companies take off-the-shelf chips, either from Mellanox or Broadcom or Intel, and they make low-cost, multi-purpose network devices. Started out just being switches. And if you've ever heard of the Facebook backpack, which is a stack of switches, they wrote their own software to do switching only the way that Facebook wanted to do switching. They didn't want to go buy a Juniper and be told how to do switching. I want to do switching this way, so they had the wherewithal to do it themselves. And Google participated in this, and Microsoft does it, and LinkedIn does it, and everybody on the West Coast, they do it. The good news is it's not just voodoo, because Linux, we've all gone through that whole discovery time where you load Linux on it, and yes, it can do that, but you have to put all that effort into it. In white box, these products are commercially supported. There are vendors, whether it be us or it be actual companies, there are vendors around the world that actually commercially support white box, even though it has that Linux feel in your environment. Mikrotik fits well into this, and they asked me to do this the other night because white box has been dominated primarily by switching, because you can go buy an OCNOS switch and load your software on it that you need. But the OCNOS environment doesn't scale in BGP and OSPF as well. So Mikrotik plugs very well into being able to do competent routing at scale with switching, so you can build networks that are redundant and inexpensive. And when I say inexpensive, 96 ports of 10 gig for $6,000. And what you can do with that, you can't do necessarily with a Brocade, or you can do that with a Juniper or an Alcatel. when the limitations, and I'm the sales guy, not terribly technical, but when I get stuck, that guy over there is going to answer my questions. White box doesn't have, you can't do large routing tables. You can't do large OSPF tables because that's not what it was intended for, because these are data center guys. Facebook built this because they wanted to have port density. They wanted to have, we have one, I'm going to refer to them as a friend, I can't say customer, but they have 300,000 servers. What are you going to plug that into? And when you need port density, you need switching, you aren't concerned about BGP. You aren't concerned about OSPF. So the work that went into this excluded those protocols that Mikrotik does very, very well. And it takes these inexpensive switches and turns this into this wonderful network. The best part of, and what makes white box relevant, and important part, is that you can load it on any different device. You don't have to be tied to the thing that's in front of you. Whether you buy a CCR, you're going to do a hypervisor, or you're going to do an x86 platform, Router OS will load on those and do what you need it to do. In the case of the 1072, when they introduced an 80 gig router, if you can route 80 gigs of traffic between two zones, you have an enormous amount of scale for $3,000. If you were going to do the same thing in a Cisco environment, you're looking at 100 grand or 80 grand, and where you can do this for $3,000. And the number one thing that we do worldwide is we practice a switch-centric architecture, where in the center of your network is a stackable switch. So you have, and in that, you plug everything into your switch, your APs, your AAA, you've got your hypervisors, you have, if you're doing GPON, everything plugs into the switch. Your ISPs plug into the switch. That way, this is the foundation for HA. Every device that's on the network sees every other device on the network. So if you lose a router, or you lose an access point, or you lose something, you can fail over to another one in either an automated or hopefully an automated sense. And this is where, since we're a switch-centric company, and this is the practice that we do, this is why white box is relevant to where we come from, and we use Mikrotik routers to make all of this work magic in an HA environment, so you're not stuck buying a Cisco ASR as a service provider. And the benefits of adopting a white box as a service provider or as an enterprise, you're going to have an enormous CapEx savings. In some cases, it's 90% on what you're going to spend. This is what I tell my elevator speech to all these big giant companies that I talk to. You're going to save 90% on your CapEx and 200 to 300% on your OpEx over a short period of time. If you're looking at we had an example. Last year, we were doing the project. It's $15.5 million of Cisco gear. And Cisco did not ship, for whatever reason, they did not ship four ASRs at 200 grand for these 4 devices. So we racked 4 CCRs because we had to finish. There was a deadline. So the customer saved $196,000. And the CCRs are doing exactly what the ASRs are intended to do, plus they don't suck 50 watts or 50 amps of power. The CCRs are much lighter. You only have to load the protocols that you need. If you don't need BGP, you don't need it on your stack. If you don't need MPLS, you don't need it there because you don't want it to interfere with something. It may not, but you don't need it there. So your network layer gets smaller and smaller and more tuned to what you want. And because this is from Google and and from Facebook, it's very automation friendly. So that's a very SDN friendly. And if you guys have looked at any SDN controllers, whether it be like Pika or Pika 8, or there's a handful, they run typically on hypervisors. So you could look like VMware bought NSX, and that is a controller of sense, but it all runs on a hypervisor. So that way you'll have a customer that needs, in the enterprise this happens, you have a customer, they need an application, it needs to be on a VLAN, so they spin up a VM, the VLANs are created and they propagate across the whole network. And that happens at the white box layer. To do that inside of Juniper, it can do it too, it just gets expensive. If you're a traditional vendor shop, we have this friend, the guy with the 300,000 servers, and he pointed out how much money that they save because they're not buying licensing, they're not paying for power. And so if you have a traditional switch, or router from a big vendor, and you're paying $15,000 a year in power or $10,000 a year in licensing, by not having to do that over time, your return on your investment by switching to white box is staggering. So my one example, in a Cisco 6509, 6800 switch, we have a customer that has a few hundred of these, and it costs around 14, 15 grand a year to keep it turned on, and it costs $6 grand a year or so to keep them licensed with Cisco. So over 3 years, it is 85% cheaper to buy a one-time purchase of doing a $10,000 stack of switches and CCRs. And they will save $53,000. And then this one customer, if they have 300 of these, if they rotate those out, well, 300 times 53,000 is a fair chunk of change. There is another customer we have that has this thing called the Nexus 7K, and it's this big hunk of metal, it's a switch. And they're buggy, and anybody that knows them knows that they're buggy. And I actually said, if you're going to spend $200,000 to $300,000 each, I bought 2 of them because they wanted redundancy. If you're going to spend $200,000 to $300,000 each, you have this entitlement that it's going to work. If we build you a replacement for $12,000, aren't you just impressed as all get out if it does? And that's what they invest in. They started with a DR site, and that's where Mikrotik can work its way into these environments, because they may not trust their core environment to it, but they can start putting it around their periphery, because Mikrotik works really well with other, because their protocol support is so well, it works well, it plays well with others in the existing network. You don't have to get rid of your other stuff. You can slowly introduce Mikrotik into these worlds and give white box some momentum into somebody that's a little bit more nervous about it. In the typical business enterprise, we all have IT budgets. Your customer might have an IT budget of $5 million or $1 million or $500 million. There's only so many projects you can accomplish when you have a monetary limit, and white box will let you accomplish more projects just because it costs less. If you can, and so your customers can get, you can get more projects done with the same amount of money, the same amount of time. There's actually I have an RFP that I read. They're looking for 12,000 switches, and they want Nexus 7s, which are 100 grand a piece. And so we're going to try and do this. But Mikrotik complements very well into the white box because protocols work. The devices are inexpensive. That's why we're here. We're here because Mikrotik's inexpensive, and that they work. And they play well with others. And it's hard to fathom how mature the platform is. Sure, it doesn't do everything right, but it does a lot of things right. But it's a very, very mature platform. Things work. And so you can put them in production environments and get predictable results over time. And we have, as a firm, IP Architects has huge success in large-scale deployments. We've got VPN concentrators that do 250,000 concurrent users. We've got hotspot controllers that do hundreds of thousands of concurrent users. And in service provider cores, you guys know what an IX is? An Internet Exchange? We've actually built IXs out of CCRs, because I think we went 860 gig on CCRs because you can do 10 gig ports and just keep racking them and stacking them. You just plug them all into switches until you reach the bandwidth limit that you need. And that is a low-cost way, because if we were to do a terabit of routing, what's a terabit of routing cost on Cisco, you suppose?
What's a terabit?
A terabit cost.
Terabit backlinks, we get into at least a couple $100,000 for a terabit.
And we did that one for 55K for 860 gig. And the platform works. Mikrotik it's almost like people don't believe that they work because they're almost too cheap. But the products do work. There's things we want to see improved, but this is what white box is. And it can be ubiquity. And in this room, it can be anything that's not a major vendor. One of my favorite things is you can repurpose the same gear for different purposes, because you're loading software on a device, just like a hypervisor. So you've got an Ocnos switch from Acton or EdgeCore, and you're doing data center to data center connections. So you'll buy an operating system that does that and load it on the switch. Then one day your business changes. So then you're going to go, okay, I don't want to do that. I don't need to do that so much as I want to do DDoS mitigation. So then you put Big Switch, the software, on the same switch. And now you can do now you can do DDoS mitigation in the switch. And you can do terabits of DDoS mitigation that way. But the switch stays the same. And that's that's the spirit of what Whitebox is supposed to do. And as we buy Mikrotik products, when they're versions of their operating systems, which are always free, so we go from OS 6 to router OS 7 and we get more and more features, it's kind of the same thing. You can make those routers do more and more as they get more and more features built in. Does that make sense? Because that's the end. Are there any questions? Wow. But that is what Whitebox is and how Mikrotik will. Now, any of you in here, are you distributors at all? Or you sell Mikrotik, or are you operators? Operators? As from an operation standpoint, because you guys are buying Mikrotik already, you know how inexpensive they are, otherwise you'd be buying Cisco. When I go back to, oops. I don't know where that went. When we get to what we do design-wise with our switch-centric core, if you were going to buy a couple of brocades that stack, you might look at $12,000 a switch to get a 10 gig with 40 gig uplinks. If you were to look at a Whitebox switch, it would be half that, a third that. And Mikrotik plays very well into that design. So that is why we enjoy as much success as we do, because we have this competent routing platform. Now, if there are no questions, at the end of the day, yeah.
I thought I'd try and ask a question for you.
Sure.
You had on one of those slides, SDN ready.
Yes.
I just thought I'd let you riff on that for a minute about SDN.
So SDN is automating the automation of creating VLANs, tearing down VLANs, things you would have network operations do. If you're in AWS cloud and you spin up a service, you need to have an IP and you need to have egress and all these things created. Whitebox is specifically built for SDN so that your customer service staff, your network engineers, your people can go to a web GUI, click enable service, and all that little magic happens. They don't have to go touch this switch and put in that tag and then extend it over to that switch and put in that tag. It happens all from an SDN controller. And there are SDN controllers that are off the shelf. You just buy them, get them configured into your environment, and they will run all of your hardware for you. They will put policies into your radios. They will put, in a sense like Radius, you can have, they click new subscriber and all this stuff happens. Whether you use the PK8, and I don't know that's the one I have the most exposure to. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
By the way, I work with Derek. I'm Kevin Myers. I'm a network architect for IP Architects. But to add to your question about the SDN specifically, SDN breaks down to a couple different components. You're either talking about automation and orchestration, or you're talking about your control plane. So, SDN is so it can be ambiguous at times because SDN can be almost anything. But where that really plays in is you're going to get a benefit in automation orchestration by exposing an API out of either that device or the Mikrotik API into some kind of a centralized automation and orchestration system, and that's one type of SDN. And then there's actually programming the forwarding plane. So if you want to make a decision on where your traffic goes without using a routing table, the other type of SDN where you get into the world of OpenFlow and Open Daylight and things like that is I want to program my forwarding plane because I want to route based on a set of policies that may be application based. Whether you're an ISP or an enterprise, you may say, I want to go the path that is least congested to move all of my Facebook traffic, or I want to move all of my, I have a custom app, I'm an enterprise, and I want to move all that traffic down a specific path, and I need a set of algorithms that can evaluate the state of the network in real time to say, I know exactly what the least congested, lowest latency path is, and I'm going to assign this level of SLA and QoS to an application instead of just a series of IPs. And assign an SLA to that flow. And so that's the other half of SDN is actually programming your forwarding plane and being layer 7 aware of traffic so that you can steer traffic in different directions. And you can really kind of do that in both those architectures because you can load OpenFlow onto white box switches, and Mikrotik at the current time supports OpenFlow 1.4. NFV, yes. That also paves the way. So actually, one of the reasons why we employ the switch-centric architecture so much is it paves the way for NFV, because Mikrotik can be an NFV component. So if you're big into NFV, for those of you that don't know what an NFV is network function virtualization. It's the idea that you can almost entirely replace network hardware into a virtual machine and a hypervisor. So whether you take a pair of switches and then you take a pair of hypervisors and you connect the hypervisors into the switches, you can launch just about any network component you need, whether it's a router, a firewall, or an IPS, or an IDS, or a BRAS PPPoE concentrator. Whatever it is, you can virtualize that component and then build it into a cookie cutter template that you can literally blast across your network. So to give you an example, AT&T is converting their entire network to NFV. They've been ripping out Cisco and Juniper for years and converting entirely to virtualization. They are 30 to 40% complete of getting all physical routers out of their network and security devices and going entirely virtual. So that would be a good NFV example if you look at AT&T's deployments.
Any more questions?
Question there, maybe for you.
Can you share a little bit more detail about how would you do traffic engineering in such an architecture?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. So there's a couple different ways. I would say there's three main things that come to mind on how you do traffic engineering. The first would be BGP, because BGP lends itself well to traffic engineering, whether you're using eBGP or an iBGP AS that you're going to put communities into. So that would certainly be one style. MPLS traffic engineering, leveraging MPLS traffic engineering to build your unidirectional tunnels to carve traffic out different ways. One thing that we haven't gotten into with Mikrotik, but you potentially will see in white box networking is segment routing, MPLS segment routing, which is a newer thing. It's segment routing is kind of like application layer, kind of like traffic engineering, MPLS traffic engineering at the application layer to be able to make decisions at layer 7 on forwarding of traffic. So because it's an open architecture, literally anything that can be programmed for the ASIC in a white box architecture can be brought into the deployment and be used. So you have the opportunity to use that. So I would say those are probably the three main ways. And then OpenFlow, something that programs the forwarding plane. You can make decisions in the forwarding plane, evaluate your traffic loads, and set policies and SLAs to say, when you're at this capacity, I want you to move these flows and these applications over to this path. So it really kind of breaks down into about 3 or 4 different ways of building and designing your traffic engineering in that architecture.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I don't remember if you answered this, I'm sorry if you did, but I need high port density in various areas, so we're running these large chassis switches that you're mentioning, the Nexuses, and I have multiple 7018s and Juniper EX 8216s that are nearly full. What would you do in a situation like that? You're talking about smaller switches, I think, right?
Yeah, so the concept when you talk about, this came out of web scale architecture. So web scale architecture is the Facebooks and Googles of the world is where this idea came from, and it's collectively known as disaggregation. So, in the data center world or even in the ISP world, when we need terabit capacity, we would look to large chassis-based switches like the 7018, and we'd be, slotting in 40 gig cards and things like that. Because you can break down, and you need a pair of supervisors to run a chassis like that so that you have a highly available system. The concept of disaggregation is I'm going to rely on a centralized controller and other components to manage the HA components of that so that I can build massive port density. And really it goes into like leaf spine architectures and what we call CLOS architectures, where you'll build a spine network and you'll build a leaf network out of it with these 1U switches. And so you disaggregate or break that chassis apart into multiple redundant 1U switches so that you can scale port density in an almost unlimited fashion. Because if you go look up leaf spine, that CLOS architecture allows you to take white box switches and scale 10 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig ports almost to infinity.
Okay. Any more? Yes.
Do you have experience in this architecture with anything prepackaged about customer billing and accounting?
Yeah, so the beauty of that architecture is you literally can bring almost anything you want into. We use this architecture in service providers, large service providers, in managed service providers. We're using it in large enterprise data centers for publicly traded companies, and we're using it in cloud data centers for things that are in like web scale. So you think of the three main disciplines of networking. The switch-centric architecture allows you to do so many different things that you can use white box switching and then Mikrotik routing to combine all those components. And then if you add an FV into it, any of the bits that you don't have, you get a pair of hypervisors and you bring whatever machines, whatever operating systems you need in to round out all the pieces that you need. So it really can scale to be just about anything you want.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, the party. Yeah, go to the party.